Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The Next. I'm your host, Mike Walker, and today we have the pleasure of sitting down with Tierney Morgan. She is a healthcare industry advocate for Microsoft. You might be wondering, what the heck is that? Essentially, she is an expert from the pharma industry that Microsoft had brought in to essentially help contextualize all the emerging technologies that Microsoft offers and make it more relatable, more actionable towards those specific industries. In this case, health and life sciences. And so we're going to talk about, what does innovation look like in the health and life sciences world? We're going to talk about a lot about kind of vaccines and the distribution of vaccines, the innovation around those vaccines. So, super timely episode, but also she's just such a smart gal with a wealth of information that I think you're really, really going to enjoy. Now, with like all episodes, all the show notes, links, all that great stuff, you're going to find on vnextpod.com. That's vnextpod.com. All right, guys, let's get into it. Tierney, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Mike. It's a pleasure.
So I'm super excited to have you on for many reasons. One, we work together and you're a really cool gal. But two, you're doing some really awesome stuff in the health and life science space. And I wanted to have you on and talk about all the cool things that you're doing. Are you game?
Oh, absolutely.
I knew you would be.
I don't do all the stuff myself. We'll talk about what a lot of us do, but yes.
So, folks might not know you as well as I do, so it'd be good to maybe understand a little bit about you. Your role at Microsoft, and maybe a little bit about how you got here.
Sure. So my role at Microsoft currently is something that's called an industry advocate. So it's specific to Microsoft's motion to really get close to each industry and understand it from the inside out. So prior to joining Microsoft, I've only been here for a couple of years. I spent over a decade in the pharmaceutical industry, most specifically in vaccines. Really, the bulk of my time was in vaccines. And I did work there, of course, in sales leadership, some operations, and a tiny bit of supply chain with some projects before I left. But how I got here really was more traditional. Microsoft hired me out of business school. I had friends in Microsoft and married a Californian. So it's always wonderful to be in technology when you love California and Californians in general. So that brought us out here. But my work most of the time was in multiple parts of the country. You move a lot with pharmaceuticals, really, to kind of understand the different parts of the industry. But it was kind of in the tri-state in Manhattan. So Microsoft brought me back to California, which my family is so grateful for, and found my way really quickly back into health and health expertise, right? So right now, all of us, our whole team, there's a group of us that have been built over the last 18 months or so in health. And we really operate as an advocate, or really like both for the customer internally within Microsoft to help Microsoft understand what health is dealing with, what life sciences is dealing with, but also to, of course, help the customer understand what they can do with technology, specifically like cloud technology and different kinds of things like digital twins, which is a huge win for Microsoft, right, for health. Yeah.
That's really cool because, what it sounds like, what you said is that Microsoft has said, look, let's not groom people within the technology field, but let's actually go and get people that have lived and breathed this particular industry.
Yeah. We joke around a lot that we're translators for both sides, right? to help our engineers understand what the customer is dealing with and vice versa, right? Help the customer understand how these engineers can support them. And it happens quickly when everybody is ready to talk. And this has been a year where everybody's ready to talk. It's a good year. It's a catalyst, needless to say.
Yeah, and we'll get into more of specifically some of the things that you're working on. But in general, when we talk about this rapid acceleration of adoption of digital, what do you think were some of the key catalysts for that rapid adoption?
Working from home was one of the key things. How to seek care and to protect everyone at the same time. So doctors needed protection, right? Especially doctors that were largely clinicians, right? That weren't hospitalists, um, to protect frontline workers, right? To minimize their exposures. But in that, they found all sorts of efficiencies. So, for example, one of our major partners, is out on here on the West Coast, a major health system. They went from doing, what did they say? Went from doing like 20, 30 calls a day for telehealth, like within a clinic, to doing over 400,000 a day,
Wow.
really. And what they found is that their sweet spot is not, under 20%, which they thought it was. It's probably more 40, 50% of their work can be done in perpetuity, right? This doesn't have to end with COVID. They've been able to do multiple calls a day. And interestingly, even though it's more work, right, in actual productivity for these physicians, it's less strain on the
Right.
physician themselves, because some of these physicians, when you think about Southern California, they were commuting in an hour, right, from the Inland Empire to come to their clinic, an hour out, but they were having the same 15-minute conversations with patients. And so now they're really being able to figure out what appointments need to be in person, what appointments don't need to be in person. And you can continue on with those two clinical routes regardless. And so, these doctors in some situations are asking for 2 days work from home a week, like the rest of us, right?
Right.
And there's no reason really to not do it, because as a patient, right, you've probably experienced it here. It's like, it's pretty convenient. You're like, what's this? What's
Yes.
this? I find myself going to the doctor more often now, because I'm like, well, is this? What do you think this is? Can we, and they're, me and my doctor are having a chit chat about it.
I can't wait for the waiting room to be on the endangered species list, because I don't ever want to go back to that real life purgatory again. It's not a fun place to be, and you're right. It's just so inefficient, and much more convenient. I think the quality of healthcare would go up even more, especially as you had mentioned IoT and digital twins and
Mhm.
things along those lines. I mean, if you think
Mhm.
about having these technologies within our home. I've got one of these. I've
Mhm.
got all sorts of different diagnostics here that my doctor could see in real time. There could be alerting, so I don't have to have an appointment necessarily. There could be,
Mhm.
oh well, I'm noticing there's these weird patterns on Mike. It's in between our 6-month or yearly visits. Maybe we should see Mike for these things because his heart's doing something weird or his blood pressure's weird or whatever it may be.
Yeah, absolutely. The kind of work that you're talking about is remote monitoring of patients, right? Especially when you're thinking about a critical patient, you're thinking of a patient that might be, you know, uh, recovering at home, ideally, but the doctor needs to do some kind of check-in. It's difficult to put that on a caretaker. It's difficult to put that on the patient themselves when they are recovering, to do that kind of reporting. But oftentimes, especially if a patient, like think about this year, is immunosuppressed, you don't want to have that patient exposed, right, to people in the waiting room. Like oftentimes hospitals are generally, some of the most germ dense areas, right?
Right.
So, the more that you can let a patient recover in a friendly, comfortable environment, the better. So, I always want to point out, when we're thinking about efficiencies in healthcare, the doctors and the people that work within healthcare want it just as much as the patient does.
Yeah.
The greatest thing that I've seen Microsoft do over the last couple of years is help these doctors really understand that technology right now for them feels like a barrier between them and the patient. And clinicians often are seeking these job out, not because they not because they love disease, but because they love
Right.
humans, right?
Right.
And they truly are looking for ways that technology can become a support system for them, right? And so that is really the true brass ring that everyone is going for, like ambient intelligence, passive monitoring, and the things like you're talking about would be fantastic, right? And to be able to read a patient's needs while they're happening real time, to be able to suggest things that are indicative of that patient, that patient focus that is not dissimilar to a customer. So, yeah, the big trend is, patient as a consumer, but the physicians themselves and the hospital system themselves is also a consumer, right? That is in need of support. And so, we always, when we're sick, it's hard not to be egocentric because you just
Right.
feel awful. And you're like, oh, where's this doctor? Why am I waiting? But there's so much happening in the
Especially
business.
me, I'm like a big baby. Like most, as I hear most husbands are, but it's like, just give me a tank full of NyQuil, knock my butt out, get me a
Mhm.
doctor's appointment, and let's get this going.
Yeah, yeah. I am not a good sick person either, and I mean, I won't speak for my husband, but don't worry, you're not alone. You're not alone.
Yeah, and
You're not.
I love the idea, and I've been really excited about this over the past couple years as this has become more popular. That the reactive healthcare. So
Mhm.
the greatest example that we can kind of joke around about is like the life alert. The fallen and I can't get up button, right?
Yeah.
But now you've got technologies, wearable technologies that detect if you've fallen over, right? And you
Mhm.
don't have to press a button and you don't have to call 911. It does it on your behalf. And so that's what's really exciting is not the reactive or not the pharma, the medical technology, but the proactive ones that is, acting either on our behalf if there's an emergency, being one extreme case, but also on the other side, doing that monitoring, as you said, and giving you interesting analytics so you as yourself, not just your doctor but yourself, can make
Mhm.
really well informed decisions. um,
Ab-
on a previous episode, I talked to someone in retail, and we talked about a story about how if he would see kind of the sustainability metrics on his groceries when he's at the
Mhm.
grocery store, that would significantly change his purchasing habits as a result. And I think that's
Like a calorie, yeah, like this has the carbon footprint of, oh yeah, it's cool.
yeah.
Yeah.
So with all this stuff going on, and you're an advocate, so maybe let's double click on a little bit about what that means. There's because this is a big space, right? Do
Mhm.
you focus on all the health and life sciences? Do you focus on specific areas? What's your area that is your focus?
Yeah, yeah. Well, we definitely, when we talk about subject matter expertise, we focus on our backgrounds, right? So my background specifically is in biopharmaceuticals, right? So in vaccines, and it's quite a year to have that kind of expertise. So I get pulled in for a lot of vaccine conversations, whether it be around manufacturing efficiencies, whether it be around R&D and drug development, or most recently, I think that's where you and I spent the most time together is distribution and supply chain.
Right.
Right. And so all of those, when you think about this last year, this is a conversation I've had with everybody from my doctor to like people I meet on the street, or like, oh, you do this, and there's been three major hurdles, right, with vaccines, and we've cleared two of them this year. We cleared the first being, can you make a vaccine that quickly, right? Which, to just utter pride in my former firm and the folks they work with, that they did what they did this year. It's a true testament to their capabilities. And then that it got out, that it was distributed. And that's, I'm gonna give a shout out directly here to UPS. Thank you for joining the cold chain supply people. You have made a big difference this year. We wouldn't have been able to and we will not be able to continue to distribute the way that we do. And then this last bit, of course, is the actual human process, the operations of how do you get it from the refrigerators to the arms
Right.
efficiently? How do we get the people in line? How do they know where they stand in line? How do we get enough vaccine to the refrigerator that the people are standing in line at? That is the final hurdle here, and that is always like the long tail problem. And so spending most of my time right now doing that, whether it's directly with the customer, right? And what Microsoft will have us do is they'll actually take somebody like me and they'll assign us to one or two firms with whom they want to do these kinds of cloud developments, right? So I have a background in health, but also in strategy. And so I'll sit down with their leaders and dig in really deep and go, what is 10 years from now? What do you want this to look like? 5 years from now, what do you want this to look like? Let's dream together. Let's
Right.
build out a few ideas. And then we'll take that, all of the notes from one of the strategists will sit down with us, somebody like some of the teams that we've worked with, you and I, and they will actually map it out, right? I'm listening and I'm facilitating and pulling these ideas out. They'll map it out. I'll help plot it into a strategy it's something that the executives on the health side will understand, right?
Right.
Terminology that they understand. And what we often do is we'll create a two-sided plan together,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so So what I'll do with the customer is I'll go with them to their leaders and go, okay, so here's what this means, right? Here's what this means. Here's what you could do. Here's what, of course, we want to do for you or help enable you to do, really, because Microsoft doesn't do that for anybody, right? They do it themselves, and we are there to support. So that's often what we're doing, and we've done it really successfully over the last year, whether it's some shorter term stuff or longer term. Like this is the one that's most exciting. I was telling you about this before, but I'll tell you again. So for example, like vaccines, we've got a new administration. There's big goals of immunizing, I believe the numbers are like 100 million patients in the first 100 days of the administration. Well, that has translated into, of course, a lot of the government entities going to these health systems and saying, can you scale up? Can your electronic health records record and immunize this many patients in this number of days? Well, most of these instances, meaning the electronic health records, can only handle so many people touching the same record or touching the system at any given time. Because most of them are still in actual servers on premises in data centers that are owned by the health system and close to the health system. Well, cloud computing allows for that hardware to really be taken off the table in the sense of the scaling issue. And so there was a major health system that reached out to us, and they were dealing with one of these problems and said, we've got to try to go from maybe doing a couple hundred instances per day with this legacy electronic health record system that they had. We need to be able to do 100,000 in a second, and they can maybe do a couple hundred at the moment. Well, they had gotten estimates internally and from other firms that said, oh, it'll take you 3 years to take this legacy system and turn it into something. And the problem's now, right? They've got to immunize patients now. We did what we do, and the customer said, we want to do this on the cloud. Our distinguished architect, Uli Homan, came in and said, absolutely, you can do it. Put myself and a few other people on a team together, and we executed in 3 weeks what they thought would take 3 years. And they could do yeah. So this is the kind of thing that when you're sitting in line as a patient, it doesn't sound sexy. It doesn't. Right. But when you're that patient that's sitting there waiting in line to get immunized, and you think it's going to be terrible because the news tells you it's going to be terrible, and then you go and you just breeze through and you're like, hey man, that wasn't hard at all. That's an example of technology enabling you to actually have a good patient experience, right? So it's exciting to watch this kind of stuff happen, and there's no glory in it because, it's like when it works really well, it's a forgettable experience.
It really is. And I think people sometimes, and I think we're all guilty of this, is, we kind of take for granted a bit that we don't see a lot of what goes on in the background. It's a bit of a black box, before you pull up to your doctor's office, a pharmacy, or, what have you, you don't know everything. Those first 2 steps that you talked about, most people don't think about that. And, I'm not an expert in this field, but, some of the things that I would tell friends and relatives that would express frustration is, I would just have to say to them, look, you have to think through that, you've got someone making something for the first time. They're not getting 1 shot, they're getting 2 shots. So think of everything's been doubled. And it's not just the shot, it's the needles. It's the wipes to sanitize. It's the this and the that. It's all the things that go around
gloves, it. PPE. And they're supposed to change it with every single patient, right? So you just think about the shortage, like nitrile gloves are in shortage right now. And the American Hospital Association has been talking about the fact that might be the new mask shortage, right? So there's so much to think about. And it's all operations, right? Again, it's all the stuff that if it works well, you don't notice it. What you notice is when it doesn't work well. And that's what's going on right now. It's not to beg empathy, but we'll put it in context. Think about an average flu year, right? And if you get a flu shot, you get a flu shot. If you don't, you don't. That's fine. But most of the time, that's one of the biggest immunization efforts a hospital system makes, right? And having worked in the industry, this is something we talked about every year, right? So that year, typical year, there's about 70 million doses that would go out in about a 3-month span, right? From like September to November. They would immunize globally. They would immunize, I'll just talk in the U.S. In the U.S., they'd immunize about 23% of the U.S. population. Well, to get to herd immunity, which is what we're aiming for right now, you need 85% of the population to be immune or immunized. we don't know what percentage of the population has actually been infected, right? That's difficult to say. You can't really, there's no QR code for that, right? You can't say, I got it. So we really have to immunize people. That's the only way we could really track them. Well, that's 3x of what we've got to do in 1 year, right? That we normally will do, by voluntarily. And it's still challenges. Like, we never had a perfect supply chain year with flu because it was always happening during fall, winter season, right? Most of it was manufactured in the Northeast, which is prone to large winter storms like the one we're dealing with this week. So that's what this means, is that operationally, there was really not a lot of ways to prepare for this. We'd been on boards for pandemic preparedness in my old industry multiple times, and you can prepare and prepare and prepare, but then you don't realize that your EHR system can handle that many instances at once. All these kinds of things you don't find out until you're in the moment. And that this has tested every supply chain out there, regardless of health. Or for a while, I couldn't get flour. I was baking bread and I couldn't get flour. And it's broken every supply chain we have. That's what global scale means, and we're learning from it. And people that are doing the things like the folks that we were working with this past week, those changes will persist. It's not something that thankfully will go away. It's not like they're going to spin up their EHR in the cloud and take it back down. Lose all that.
Now, I want to highlight one of the things that you said. You'd said about getting the vaccine to be able to track. Now, I was wondering if you were working with Bill Gates to put those nasty little trackers in people as they were getting vaccinated. I'm just kidding. I'm joking.
Wow.
I had to throw the conspiracy theory thing out there real quick at you.
Well, I'll tell you an anecdote, but this is about my husband. He was determined when we had our first child that should be a thing we should be able to do to our children. And the nurses were like, ha, ha, ha. And he goes, no, I'm serious. If I can chip my dog, why can't I chip my child? And they said no. They politely said, no, you cannot put a chip in your daughter. And so, darn it, we'll have to do it ourselves. But the QR coding, right, would more so be voluntary. Right. And it would be allowable for there is work that's being done more so from the government perspective, as well as the private sector, to be able to say, hey, when we want to start opening up a site for more frontline workers, when we want to start opening up a site from people visiting from other firms, what is a sustainable, universal way that we could say that this person is immune? Right. Yeah. And have it be a verifiable source. Well, QR code is the easiest way to do that, right? We've been using it to order French fries at restaurants for the past few months. Like, we could easily do it once you get your vaccination. And so that's something that's being talked about avidly. And that is across multiple, Microsoft is not leading that, but we are absolutely participating in that. And that's, ideally the best way that it could be done, right? Because it's vaccine industry, pharmaceutical industry, distribution industry, everybody needs to be able to travel, right? They all need to be able to say, can we safely go back to this, and how can we do that? Versus, some of the flying and things that are happening now where people are getting tested ahead of time, but being able to have it be verifiable, repeatable, it's challenging, right? You have to get a lot of people talking to each other that never really had to talk to each other before.
Right. Yeah, and for someone like me, like my body's not a stranger to vaccinations. I mean, you probably are a global traveler just as I am, and having your handy dandy trusty yellow card with you at all times with your passport. Do you think that these kind of health passports are going to be something that's going to be required in society going forward? Because obviously, this isn't necessarily going away. We see variants to this, and who knows what that will mean. I mean, I'm not, don't have a crystal ball. I don't think anybody does. But we know that at least with this case of, the COVID-19 bit, we got lucky in a lot of regards that it wasn't as bad or as lethal, etc. But do you think that this is going to be behavior changing, and that as a society, we're going to have to be more conscious of vaccinations than we've been in the past?
It's a great question. Well, immunity will come from infection naturally, right? Or from immunization. So, which would be artificial or whatever however you'd like to refer to it. that'll happen regardless. So, this kind of global pandemic happens approximately every 100 years. If you think back to, 1918, the Spanish flu, it was very effectively mitigated by masking, right?
Right.
Interestingly, the politics at that time were really similar to the politics we dealt with this pandemic. But since then, right, and they knew that masking was effective. Since then, we still don't have a culture, at least in the US, where masking during flu season is standard behavior, right? So I'll repeat for you what I've often repeat for a lot of my friends and family is that the most successful mitigation tactic often breeds apathy, meaning we probably will go back to status quo of some sort. When people don't like to wear masks, they'll probably go back to not wearing masks when they're able to do so. But effectively, COVID will mutate. The flu has mutated, and the flu is still a risk. 35,000 people die from the flu every single year. Last year, 2020, over 50,000 people died. Like, it was one of the worst flu years ever on top of COVID. So COVID, I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not an epidemiologist, right? But it will continue to be a risk for as long as it is a risk, because it is its own organism that wants to live and breed and propagate, right? That's why it's mutating and changing. So the good news is that we have vaccines, we have mitigation tactics that can address that. At the very least, I hope that people will just not go to work sick anymore.
Right.
Or like at the very least, like, or don't go to the gym sick. I mean, I'm trying to get healthy, and then you come there and you get me sick. And so, we at least perhaps will be more considerate of each other for a few years. But once, when I see people deny a flu vaccine, I'm always surprised, because it's like getting the flu, even though it doesn't kill you, feels like you got hit by a Mack truck.
It sucks, man.
It's awful. I was 25 the first time I really remember getting the flu. And I remember going to my doctor shivering with like 105-degree fever, going, I think I'm dying. And she's like, no, you have the flu, honey, And I was like, well, why would I ever choose to get this versus, you got to work for a week versus getting a vaccine? I mean, obviously I'm pro-vaccine, but people will make their own choices, and they're allowed to do that. Like, everyone has the right to risk their lives. We don't have the right, unfortunately, to risk other people's lives. Yeah. So that is what will probably, if there's any oversight with this, it'll be really people saying, well, what does that mean? What does that risk mean? And that's a good conversation for us to have, probably. But I do anticipate that there'll be some well-earned apathy in probably a decade or so. And the younger generations will remember what this time was like, but they won't be scared of it the way that we are, because they'll understand that there's treatments, there's mitigation tactics, there's vaccinations, there's alternatives.
No, it makes a ton of sense. And I think you bring up great points, that we're all human beings, and we're creatures of habit. Also, another thing that's going against us is we're social animals. Right. And it's actually a double whammy. We're social, and the majority of our communication is nonverbal. And so, all these cues, I mean, if I'm covering up half my face, I mean, you don't know if I'm smiling, am I happy, or am I giving you my angry face? What's going on here? So I think, you're right in a lot of ways there. Now, outside of the behavioral side and the societal side, if you're okay with this, you'd mentioned 3 key pillars. You'd mentioned the vaccine piece and the development and R&D. You had mentioned, okay, well, how the heck do we distribute this around the world, and the global supply chain and what that looks like. And then the third piece, you talked about the last mile and actually putting needles in arms. So with the first piece, I'm curious, this is the first time we've been able to develop a vaccine this quickly. What innovations did it require for us to do this?
That's a great question. And, not having been deep within it, like prior, I can't speak to the specifics, but just the sheer orchestration. But to be honest, we have created vaccines this quickly before, right? You think back to H1N1 back in 2009. This the certain aspects of this vaccine too were borrowed from some of the research from the SARS vaccine that was developed when, I think it was approximately about 12, 15 years ago, if you remember back to the SARS epidemic, right? It was an epidemic at that time, which we were concerned that would become a pandemic. So they can develop vaccines relatively quickly. The challenge, of course, sometimes is isolating the strain, and then of course the testing of it. But oftentimes, for example, with flu vaccine, they'll oftentimes using the same growth compound, the same protein compound, right? And the WHO will identify a strain via their epidemiologists, make recommendations for those strains every year, and then they're actually using the same protein that's been tested to be safe and effective. And then they just have to ensure that viral compound, right, or that attenuated virus, right, RNA, can actually attach to that protein, right? It'd be super layman's terms. Please, anybody who's actually developing vaccines, forgive me. I'm trying to, explain it in a way that my children understand. This is what we talk about a lot. So that is really common. And so knowing that these firms have that kind of background available to them, and the way that people collaborated, like that is what, talking about strength of humans, right? That is what made this happen, is that humans came together and they said, humans that typically do not collaborate together, came together and said, like my old firm, Sanofi Pasteur, hey guys, love you, they collaborated with one of their biggest competitors, GlaxoSmithKline, and they're still collaborating to develop, because if we're going to get to scale, right, globally, we need that kind of collaboration. And so nobody can do this alone. And that's what really had to happen from the get-go. And, the scientists really had to say, let's prioritize this one area, right? So they had to take manufacturing lines and pull it over. But some of the things that they did that was really exemplary to develop the kind of logistics that they did for this, and this is something that, to me is the keystone to what these manufacturing firms can continue to do, is they start to looked at digital twins, right? So they looked at some of their manufacturing facilities. They figured out operationally, how can we pull things off the line to maximize efficiency and maximize development, right? Or manufacturing of the vaccine. So for example, like sometimes when, they're doing this specific R&D to keep these trials going, they would actually have to use the same line to manufacture the vaccine that they were doing for the clinical trial, as well as the vaccine that they're making for current commercial use, right? Say you're looking at something like meningococcal, right? You've got a current meningococcal, and then you've got a new meningococcal that you may be testing. Well, you might probably manufacturing on the same line, because to the same point, you're maybe using a same proteins compound, right? Well, they have to reprioritize all sorts of things. It is truly math to an astounding level that humans can't do from an operational perspective. But when you can build a virtual manufacturing facility, and you can run different kind of operational instances and identify where your bottlenecks will be ahead of time, it changes everything, right? And we in the vaccine industry have lived through year after year after year of supply chain challenges, because sometimes it's like, how do you update and keep the commercial demand met? Because biologicals are not dissimilar from farming, right? It's a biological product. It has to grow, it has to develop, and it has a limited shelf life, right? So you only want to manufacture to demand. So you can't just sit around, right? So so those are some of the things that we know the major firms did. But the biggest thing they did is collaborate, and they started to ask, what are we not looking at? What, and they kept to their guns about the fact that science comes first, right? It wasn't just about speed. It wasn't just about safety, which, safety is critical, right? We don't want to give something that would harm somebody to protect them. Like, it doesn't work that way.
Right.
So, but they really did look at, how can we help each other, and how can we think through the problem faster? And when we were in the industry, I remember one of my leaders talking about distribution. Remember how we talked about how challenging distribution was? And they were thinking like about the bottleneck that was literally created at the loading dock of, how do you get that many vaccines from the direct manufacturer on the trucks, and how do you track it from the dock to the trucks? Well, they solved that problem this year. And I mean, of course, they did it by scaling, but they also did it by actually asking the people who work in logistics from the shipping firms to come onto the dock. Because guess who understands logistics better than anybody out there? Transporters, right?
Yep.
UPS. They did, and that's one of the things that we heard directly about. And then, one of these firms, they actually ended up manufacturing their own dry ice, right?
Mm.
These logistics firms, they figure out, oh, this needs to be kept hyper cold. We're going to build facilities ahead of time. And they collaborated directly. And Operation Warp Speed did a lot of that, got everybody talking to each other, but leaning on people for their real competencies, right? Not just on this vertical integration, which hey, kudos to everybody out there that does vertical integration. Like, it's great. It's a wonderful cost-effective model, but it doesn't allow for really sharing of ideas and like compounding list of ideas. And that's what happened this year. You know, it's just coming back to people caring for each other.
Now, what I've heard you say, especially about the kind of that first leg, around the development of the vaccine, you had mentioned some key lessons was collaboration, and
Mm-hmm.
breaking down those barriers that were there before, right, wrong, or indifferent. You had
Mm-hmm.
mentioned leveraging technologies like IoT to create simulations, with digital twin technology,
Mm-hmm.
simulations and modeling of environments, doing what if scenarios, all that great stuff to kind of understand the unknown a bit more, scenario
Mm-hmm.
plan. I'm sure that you're peppering in a bit of artificial intelligence in there to do
Yes.
some probabilistic analysis. But also, some of the more fringe technologies, technologies like quantum computing is talked about quite a bit in this particular field. Did you hear or experiment with quantum computing in this space at all?
Not yet, not personally, right? But of course, it's a consistent discussion. So some of the stuff that you've brought up around predictive analytics, right? Predictive maintenance, like those are achievable now, and those are the kinds of things that they're doing in addition to digital twins to figure out not only how can we maximize capacity on a line or on a site, but how can we actually figure out when something's going to go wrong
Right.
and get ahead of it, right? Plan for that downtime, and so those are the kinds of things that are so achievable right now, and that would really prevent some of the pipeline issues that we've seen in years past. Again, I'm speaking from experience with vaccines. We saw multiple flagship products go down for years at a time and create actually some of these diseases resurging, especially in pediatrics. So those are preventable now and achievable. And the great news is that the industry knows it, and so they want to understand how to do that. Now, things around quantum computing are again so near term, right? But with these huge mathematical problems, thinking along the levels of, you talked a little bit about using mobile devices, right, or using wearable devices to monitor a patient. Well, what if you could go the next level and actually have clinical decision support for the physician themselves? Meaning, you understand all these metrics about a patient. You understand too, societally, these metrics typically would, quantum computer could identify trends within a certain patient population, and they could identify within a patient's chart what would that patient with any kind of likelihood be looking at. So what if a doctor could look at you, and you with all good intents and purposes will talk to your doctor about what you're feeling and thinking at the time, but we've all gone on WebMD and you're like, okay, you give them your 5 things and it says, there's 5 things there, and one of them's always cancer,
Yeah,
right?
I'm
Well,
always dying on WebMD.
yeah, you always are thinking like, oh, is this just a mole or is this cancer? Well, working with a doctor, of course, they're the clinician and they're there to diagnose, and we need a human being there to make those judgment calls, lay hands on people and really see and feel and discuss. But there are things that are always omitting, and no human, whether it's the human reporting, the patient, or the human that's diagnosing, can read every single thing in a chart and synthesize it quickly enough in a 15-minute turnaround. That's what quantum computing can do, right? And clinical decision support, or more, just as excitingly, we're talking about social determinants of health, right? And could you, for example, raise up within a community, knowing there's certain communities that are going to have environmental exposures, there's certain communities that are going to deal with natural disasters. Of course, with the pandemic, we know that there's certain communities that are more affected for obvious reasons. What if we could do contact tracking? All of that, and have social intervention support along with your chart. So doctor could say, you live in this neighborhood's been affected by radon in the ground, and you're seeing these symptoms. Maybe it's not an upset stomach. Maybe you actually have radon poisoning.
Right.
That's not that's something we're all, but you would want to know. So these are things that, of course, physicians have been dreaming of for years. But now that with quantum computing as a capability, that kind of computational effort, especially with a well-trained algorithm and a machine learning overlay, it's achievable.
Right.
And those are the kinds of things that we're talking real time with health systems, but also with pharmaceutical firms to think through as they're doing their own research. Could they be identifying these things, looking at post-marketing research, right, as they're sharing out any kind of adverse events, and identify these things ahead of time and figure out, oh, well, let's avoid adverse events in these kinds of populations through predictive analytics.
Yeah, totally. Now,
Yeah.
originally, what I thought you were going to say was you're going to go all Elon Musk on me and start talking about putting chips in people.
Yeah.
But we won't go there. But I do think, on a side note, I do think the whole biohacking thing is a fascinating place, and just the amount of technology that's been developed over the past 5 years. We've been talking about this stuff for 20 years, but over the past 5 years, it's just exploded, and crazy sci-fi stuff like brain computer interface and those sorts of things is just crazy sci-fi stuff. But that's for another day. But for today, see, I get distracted too. See, squirrel. So if you had, if a DeLorean showed up in your driveway, special package by Doc Brown, and you could go back in time. So, to the beginning of the whole pandemic, and as people were doing the R&D around the vaccine and trying to figure out how to deal with it, what do you think, based on your experience, based on what from a technology perspective, right? And we're not judging any one company on what they did right or wrong, but essentially, what would have been extremely valuable to look at from a technology innovation perspective if you could go back in time? Some of those kind of lessons learned. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm going to go really simple here.
Yeah.
Because it's still super achievable and it's not being utilized yet. Is getting the COVID vaccine out. They did prioritize it correctly, and critical. They beat all estimates, all timelines that anybody put out there, right, including their own. However, what suffered from that is all the other clinical trials, right? For two reasons. One, patients were, these were optional. So patients were opting to not go in and maybe finish the metrics of their clinical trials. So clinical trials get elongated, and which is the most expensive thing about drug development actually is the clinical trials themselves, right? Is managing those clinical trials. And then new trials got elongated. Some of them were dismissed, and patient interactions, they couldn't figure out how to do some of the basic modern workplace interactions for these clinical trials to keep them going, to get them started, to recruit patients, to keep patients coming, to follow up with patients. All of that is available through basic telehealth tools and basic collaboration tools that exist today. All these firms need to do, and pharmaceutical buzz, I'm talking to you, is you really just need to take advantage of the same modern workplace tools that you've been using all through this year and apply it to the clinical workspace. These platforms exist now where you can get all of the documents that you need read, identified ahead of time. And once you start putting these documents together, right, and using perhaps some simply developed architecture to create forms that the user interface can be simple, it can be universal, it can be repeatable, and then you can actually start tracking these protocols to find out which ones are best. So there was no reason, and we didn't know this, of course, at the time, because there was just this learning curve when it came to virtual tools, when it came to modern workplace tools. We live this in the tech industry all the time. Like anybody who comes, it's like they time travel coming here because their old firms were not doing this kind of work, right? That's what I experienced. And but pharma, absolutely, research and development can absolutely benefit from everything that they're benefiting in from their personal life right now. They just don't really know that it actually already all works together because they're dealing with it in little bits and pieces. But all you got to do is really just pick one of your platforms, lay these all together, and then boom, you have a virtual clinical trial space. This is a bit of a flag that my team and I are carrying right now because we know how easy it is. And there's so many other drugs, especially when you look at things like rare diseases, that their patients will cancer, all these kinds of things. Patients will truly, truly suffer if they're not able to develop these drugs quickly. So, you know,
That makes total
there's
sense.
there's not just loss of life from COVID itself this year. There's a lot of loss of life from other diseases that have been deferred.
Right.
So, we can keep that going with the things we've learned this year.
Right. Yep. Totally.
Mhm.
Now, so we talked about kind of that first stage, with the vaccines, and then you got the supply chain. And what's interesting about the supply chain that I am fascinated about is understanding that there was actually a ton of regulation that was,
Mhm.
just was created before the whole pandemic arrived, that's centered around the ability to track and trace drugs through the supply chain. Now,
Mhm.
one of the major benefits that they were focusing on was fraud, and
Mhm.
all the different things that can happen because that whole supply chain is ripe with bad actors and counterfeit pharmaceuticals, and it's from some estimates it's up to 200 billion. Raise your pinky up when you say that. 200 billion
Mhm.
in revenue for the bad guys, and obviously the good guys don't like that, and the customers certainly don't like getting counterfeit drugs. So
Mhm.
it's unfortunate, kind of going full circle here, that we didn't come to those regulations sooner.
Mhm.
I feel, from an outsider, kind of tangentially interacting with what's going on. It feels like that would have solved a lot of problems. Not all of them, but it would have solved a
Mhm.
lot of the problems. Would have at least had some durability to our supply chains. But I don't know. I guess for that second
Mhm.
leg in the supply chain, what do you think were some of the key innovations there in the supply chain?
Well, we had mentioned some of it is scale, right? And
Right.
a lot of it was scale, but that the log, we always just call it a log jam, right? But the log jam that would seem to happen from the handoff for the manufacturers themselves to the transportation firms, right? There was just, and sometimes it was just a matter of hours, right? Just a blank period of time that folks would be looking and waiting. Like we were working on flu vaccine, and we're like, hey, we can see that your shipment left the dock, right? I could call the manufacturer because we worked for him and say, where is so and so's vaccine? Oh, that lot number is on this, is just left the dock at this time. And then waiting for it to show up in the transportation firm's logs, while that was all connected through API. Sometimes it was 2 or 3 hours. Well, when it's coming from Northeast PA and going to Brooklyn, that's 2 hours, right? So if it takes 2 hours to show up and then boom, you find out it's going to the wrong location, that happened over and over and over again. Not that frequently, but often enough where when you're reading and you think about every single one of those vials represents a life,
Right.
right? In this particular, and a life that is waiting and that is nervous and that has economic impacts associated with it, right? Both for better, good and bad, right? In the
Right.
sense that if we lose that life, the loss of that income, right, to everyone involved. So we have to, they're precious. We have to treat them that way. And what innovation has really happened here is, part what we talked about with the human factor of bringing these logistic experts into the dock with you, right? And trusting them and creating that contract there, but thinking through all aspects of it, not just the package and the coding and the API, but what about the dry ice? What about the boxes? What about the actual deep down to the raw goods that are associated with that? The people that have succeeded here, and this is a success story in supply chain. The people that have succeeded here thought about all of that underneath it, in addition to the tech. Now, what
Yep.
we can do is so much bigger than what has already been done, because we're not. While the vaccine has been developed and there are some doses out there, there's less than 10% of what's actually needed, right?
Right.
So there's a lot to do. There's a lot of work to do, and the scale of it. And if we want to do it faster, you have to find more efficiencies. So how could you do that, right? You identifying track and trace, having that built into, but having that built across APIs. One of the things that we've talked, you were on some of these calls, I believe, with us when we talked a lot about vaccine management as a platform,
Yep.
right? And so, there's how many people actually touch the vaccine management process. Well, when you think about from the patient's arm and go all the way back to where it started, there's at least 6 or 7 different entities that need to touch it, in addition to the people that need to track it, right? Government entities, local, state, federal. And none of those firms have systems that speak to one another. But in order for a health system to actually get more vaccine, they need to verify what have they given, right? And how can they get more? And where is it once it gets there? So if we, for example, had all of these firms operating on a platform where they spoke to one another, and that reporting system was, thankfully, our chief medical officer, David Rue, thought through this really early on. He's part of the Worldwide Health team, which is my team. And we also were talking about this real time. Now, he was the innovator of it because he was able to get state and local government speaking to healthcare firms, speaking to transportation firms, and talking ultimately to the manufacturers, right? So this is the missing link. And when we lived through the epidemic of H1N1, we only had 3 months to deal with this. Thankfully, we got the vaccine. It took extra time, and we had protocols to distribute it, but it never worked. Right? We got people immunized, but probably well past flu season. And so we were able to catch them on the next year, really. But that's those standalone vaccines, they require all sorts of integration. And even as early as 2017, health systems and government entities, they weren't talking to each other. This is the first time that they've actually got the opportunity to do it because of cloud computing and because of platforms that have been built with open API to integrate them. And so they don't need to piece it together themselves anymore, right? We just actually need to sit down as a group and go, we all are touching this. It's important to all of us. Let's figure out a process. And we can, for example, with any of these pharmaceutical firms, help them build in the API connectors that would get them connected to this platform so that they can see what the state of New Jersey is doing, what the state of Delaware is doing, what, speaking internationally, what Singapore is doing, and what the state of Victoria in Australia is doing. This vaccine management specifically is something that is thinking about, like, going all the way back to the beginning of our conversation. We were talking about, what if this is here to stay? Well, in my mind, I was like, dude, we were always dealing with this. Like, this was my career for a decade, and I've reminded these folks that I'm talking to now are not always the heads of infectious disease. Sometimes they're the head of public health nursing, right? And saying this is not a platform that is one and done, right? I keep teasing them, going, guys, remember this time last year when we were figuring out how to redistribute PPE because we were literally fighting over a single box of masks in some situations. And we said to ourselves, well, gosh, we got to figure this out now because COVID's probably going to be done by May. That was last year. So we don't know what the future holds, but the good news is that these platforms can be used and scaled in any situation, whether that's flu, whether that's COVID, and COVID and flu maybe come here to stay and everybody gets both shots every year, who knows, or the next big thing. Yeah. Right. And these platforms will need to be in a new world where talking to each other, not just verbally, but technologically, is going to be the expectation, right? Yeah. Not just the pie in the sky dreaming, right?
Well, so you're right, and I think that's an important perspective for folks to have. Is that we're talking about COVID because it's the thing right now, but there are diseases that are hundreds, maybe thousands of years old that we're still dealing with. I mean, I've got, I think, 6.5 more years before I need to get re-upped for my yellow fever, malaria, typhoid, all those exotic vaccinations because, I travel to places like Brazil and Africa and all sorts of different places. And so, we still have to stay on top of this. We still need these types of platforms. And, so this isn't new, like you said. And I think it's just people need to understand and not rest on their laurels this next time around, because, if you listen to people like Bill Gates, as an example, and I'm not saying that because we're Microsoft, but, he's been doing tons of really great stuff out there. And, he's just like, look, guys, while I've been talking about this for years and kind of raising my hand, this is going to happen again. And it's not going to be 100 years. It might be 10 years. It might be 5 years. Because the dynamics of this particular virus is very different than the dynamics of other viruses out there, meaning that most viruses, they don't want to kill you because they want to live too.
Mhm.
You know, the way that this is transmitted is very different than many other types of viruses, at least
Mhm.
doing it in this type of fashion, this quickly, and the mutations are happening much quicker. So, you know, I
Yeah.
think that, you know, while we've got a hopefully a handle on things, I'm not a doctor, so don't take my word for it. But
Mhm.
you know, we've at least got some really, really good solutions, and I hope people take it seriously. I hope people, you know, just do the right thing, not get sick, just, you know, just get a small little prick in the arm and just do it, man.
You know, there's going to be substantially more demand than there is going to be supply for a very long time. So people, like we said, have every right to risk their lives. They really do. And it is a personal choice. And, you know, but it's good to know that that's your choice. That'll be my choice for sure too. But a lot of folks have differing opinions on it. And that is their God-given right.
Yeah, and also, you know, I want to make sure, especially, you know, of course, these are just our personal opinions and doesn't represent the opinions of our employer. But also, you know, these are much bigger conversations as well. So, you know, let's definitely, you know, if you're up for it another time, let's definitely talk about the kind of the behavioral societal things, because I do think that this is also something different, that with all the asymptomatic things that go on, is that you actually do impact other people's lives. And, you know, what does that mean from a societal perspective, and how does that really affect your rights, or does it? And so I don't have a great answer for that, but obviously, as you know, I've got plenty of opinions about
Yeah,
it.
there's fantastic, like out of Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. One of the major, and I'm blanking on his name right now, but one of the key developers of the rotavirus vaccine
Yeah.
has significant thoughts around this topic, and so he'd be a great person to research. I'll have to ping you his name when I remember it. I'm sorry, sir, if you ever see this. You're a wonderful contributor to health, and so yeah, I living in California, you know, it's in working in the industry that I did for so long. It was always, you know, it's a personal choice, and no parent has the right to tell another parent what choice to make, because medical choice has risks,
Yep.
right? So that is just where we're gonna. You know, I'm happy to leave that. Obviously, my personal opinions and clinical decision making. You know, I'm not a clinician. I'm a strategist, but it's evident, and you have to make those choices yourself. You really do. You have to
Yeah,
weigh the risks.
let's leave that there. Uh,
Mhm. Mhm.
so so on that, so, you know, we're continuing with the theme here of cheesy '80s references. If
Ooh.
you had a magic telephone booth and you could go back in time and propose any new way of thinking or lesson learned for kind of the supply chain segment of this, you know, what would
Yeah.
you tell a year ago you, to say, hey, you really need to look at this aspect. This was something that I didn't think of that I should have thought of.
That I didn't think of, or did the customer didn't think of.
Just in general, from an industry perspective.
Hmm. I'll be frank. There are very few firms still thinking about digital twins, right? There's maybe one or two that are actively talking about. The rest of them are thinking about it, but how many have actually taken action on it? They know it exists. Do they know what it could do? So how many consulting firms are you talking to right now about solving this problem for you, and how many actual technological firms have you talked about what could they do?
Right.
Because thinking back to the solution where, you know, this firm was estimating they would take them 3 years to get their legacy tool up and running, and it really took 3 weeks. When they finally said, please, just how would you do this, you know, engineer at Microsoft, how would you do this?
Right.
And the ideas are free. These firms are willing to give you ideas. What really you're going to pay for, which you would pay for regardless, is the operational expense of taking these capital pieces that you have and putting them into OpEx. That's it. That's it. And it's that simple. And it is a leap. It is a leap, but it doesn't need to be a leap of faith. It's actual, like, verifiable technological choice. And
Right.
so if anything, I would want to talk directly to all of these brilliant people that I worked with in these other firms to say, these challenges that you're running into with the supply, with manufacturing, with development, can be easily thought through by just putting a digital twin of your manufacturing facility, of your operational processing. Shoot, you could look at like how people move around your campus and figure out where is the best place for us to actually put our money. And so I would encourage any firm, pharmaceutical or not, to actually look at that real time now, because the folks that are thinking about doing it and the folks that are actually doing it, that's the difference between who is succeeding right now and who may not.
Yeah, totally.
Mhm.
And what do you think about technologies like blockchain? There's a lot of hype around that. There's been actually some really good work as far as tracking and tracing assets across supply chains using this technology.
Mhm.
What's your opinion on the usage of blockchain technology in this type of use case?
This one is where I'd actually call you, Mike, and I'd go, "Hey, Mike, tell me about this because this is not an area, unfortunately, I've had to deal yet." But that's the best part about working with folks like you is that there's experts everywhere, and the coolest, smartest people I've ever worked with are at Microsoft. So,
Yeah, I mean, the really interesting thing about that technology is a lot of the things that we talk about as problems with the supply chain. The
mhm,
technology just part of naturally as part of that technology, it accounts for that, and so it reduces the amount of you mentioned a lot about APIs, right? Instead
mhm,
of deliberately creating APIs to forcibly connect things together, this is a
mhm,
peer-to-peer system. So,
mhm.
think of like, back in, the old days when people used to steal music on Napster, the whole bit torrenting
I
thing,
never
right?
did that. I never did that.
No one ever did that. Come on.
No, no.
So, it's a lot like that. It's everyone's
Mhm,
connected within that particular ecosystem, right? And so
mhm,
that's what's great about that technology. Not only that, but also it's leveraging old school things that were invented in the Middle Ages, like the double ledger rule, meaning, if everyone else has the same thing and you're the only one that doesn't have the same exact transaction list, something's funny
mhm,
here, right?
mhm,
And so, kind of having that built-in verification, but also transparency. Making sure that everything, at least most things, are transparent, so that if there are bad actors, while you can't stop because bad people will do bad things, but if there
mhm,
is, it's audited and we all can see it. And so
mhm,
that is a natural kind of psychological, social engineering type of mechanism that prevents things like fraud, even accidental fraud, because oftentimes some of this isn't even malicious. It's
mhm,
something that happens due to accidents. We see this a lot in AI as an example. With
mhm.
some of the bias that's built in.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to go on a blockchain rant, but those are some of the things that I think are really interesting about this particular area. Is that
Mhm,
whole immutability? That transaction's written in stone. You can't change it. It is what it is. It's visible. It's all algorithmically encrypted. So it's got the people say it's tamper proof, but I like to say it's tamper resistant because I still
mhm,
believe anything could be hacked,
mhm.
given smart people enough time and access to machines. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think those are some of the things there. Um,
That's one of the funnest things and thinking about change management, right? Because a lot of the leadership in these industries they're hundreds of years old, right? And not that the people running them are hundreds of years old, but most of the time they have high retention of talent because they're wonderful places to work, right? I
right.
remember Sanofi Pasteur, I think they said that if you stayed past 2 years, you were like it was like 90% chance that you were going to finish your career there. Just
Wow.
wonderful place to work, right? And so that often means that you know what you know very, very well. These ideas sometimes sound like like sci-fi to them, but right. And so making it real to these firms and talking about what that would mean to them. That's something that would you and I should talk a lot more offline about what that would really how that could really function and think about the ideas there because it's not a common topic right
Right.
now, even in supply chain.
Right.
Right. But there's great firms like Johnson and Johnson who have some of the biggest supply chains in the world, right? That they could think through those problems really easily. So it'd be fun
So,
to talk about.
so speaking of the supply chains and outputs of the supply chain, so lastly, talking about the last mile and the innovations that are happening there. I mean, obviously, ton of logistics and planning required, but from a technology innovation perspective, what did you see as kind of major innovations that occurred there that kind of helped make this possible as well?
The biggest thing about vaccine, and are we still talking vaccine, or are we just talking more so like with health in the last year for
I would say, a vaccine, but you can dip into health a little bit. Just in general, kind of over the past year, kind of how has this changed? Because it feels like we hit a bit of a digital tipping point here this past
Mhm.
year.
Mhm. Well, people have experienced certain efficiencies that they may never want to go back to the other ways. Like, as challenging it as has been to be with your family every day, you're like, I don't want to necessarily go back to not seeing my family every day, right? Like, what's that? Where's the happy medium? That's going to be the big deciding point for healthcare as well. The last mile, and when we're talking about healthcare, the last mile would really truly be from the health provider to the patient, right? We've already delivered it. The patient has it. The healthcare system has the means there to give it to the patient. But where's the patient? How do you get it to the patient? Well, the communication and the concept of omnipresence, right, is really valuable. And that is where people that are starting to think through ahead of time what the patient experience is, then that's where the most success has happened. So a lot of that is done through different kind of CRM systems, but mostly it's the integration of all three systems and having them be cloud-based and learning from one another. So not dissimilar from what we talked about with the capabilities that could exist with clinical decision support and the overlay of machine learning on top of all sorts of statistics and then the patient chart and what have you. Well, this is where they looking at the patient as a consumer of everything that they touch within the healthcare system and ensuring that that patient understands, the billing understands where they are, the health plan understands where they are, the reporting via that health plan to the immunization process, the accountable care that's associated with that immunization, all of those systems talking to each other. There's a few health systems out there that are actually thinking about it, and it's been fun coming from the East Coast to the West Coast and dealing with two really fantastic healthcare systems as a patient on both of those, getting to see how they're each dealing with it. And I gotta say, the one out east, they're just dealing with it so well. You're Presbyterian, good job. And so they're doing it really, really well in the sense that they are sending me updates every week. This is where you are within this protocol. This is where you live. This is the likelihood. These are the immunization places that are closest to you. They're all just doing this based off my patient chart and my address, right?
Hmm.
But they're actually letting me click through. I could schedule an appointment. I can enter in my insurance. I can get it paid. They get paid. They can report back to the New York Immunization Registry where those are, and everybody, the cycle starts all over again. Right now, I told you
Right.
that the real missing link is that they should be talking to the pharmaceutical firms and the transportation firms, and everybody should know what the supply chain looks like so we can prioritize. But that's the difference, right? That some of these health systems are taking that as a real serious approach, and the patient feels cared for even when they're not there, right? And then of course the benefits that creates to the entire health system, which right now we need to understand is inclusive of transportation, is inclusive of government reporting, is inclusive of public health and local state. So all of that needs to happen together, and the people that are doing it are the people that are helping everyone. So good job. Thank you.
No, yeah,
Give it up.
totally. And
Mhm.
I think from my perspective, I've got a little bit of experience in this area, very, very, very little. But I've got a patent out there with actually one of our companies that we work with quite a bit, GE Healthcare.
Mhm.
With kind of health passporting and getting people back to work and the transportation system, like airlines and trains and all that great stuff, getting that up and moving. And so we worked really hard on, creating essentially that passport, that digital health passport. And this was more focused on the workers, less about the broader citizens, because that's a different problem with a different set of regulations, et cetera. But for the workers, those frontline workers that are helping keeping, all those logistics bits that we talked about in that second pillar going, we had to make
Mhm.
sure that they can be safe and effective at work. But
So
I
cool.
think some of the things, and these aren't necessarily innovations, but I think some of the things as a result of this uh, that are really good kind of lessons learned is one, we understood kind of where all the holes are.
Mhm.
And there were a lot of holes. And while we've band-aided and we fixed some of those, I think it's really bubbled to the surface around kind of the diversity factor, right? And some of the poorer communities, don't have the same access based
Mhm.
on how far the pharmacy is away from them, right? And there is no public transportation or what have you. I
Mhm.
think that's been obviously that's terrible that that's occurring or has occurred based on where things are at. But at least now we know and we can make
Mhm.
action. We can change it. So I
Mhm.
think that's incredibly valuable. I think the innovation. I mean, there was a young girl. I think she was like a teenager. She actually built an app
Mhm.
for what state was it? Was it Pennsylvania? Was it New York? One of those
Well, I
states.
well, and I'm probably mixing up with a recent story where I saw where a mom just built like an easier UI to actually have a user interface to talk to the patient portal that they had to register. And that's the one that she distributed to everybody, and she set up the API herself because it was open, and so
Yep.
it filled in this much more complex user interface,
Yeah.
and all of her grandparents and family members could use it and sign up faster. So yeah, I mean, it can, like, those kind of low code, no code, or citizen developers, that is something that actually is going to be the real linchpin in healthcare systems innovating faster, is because the people that are, like, everybody loves IT. I mean, we're Microsoft, we love IT. That said, they're not often the users, and so having a product owner in IT be separate from the actual user, when you can develop a platform like Power Apps that's low code or no code, and you can spin up an app for your user base that is like maybe even team based. That's ideal, right? And that's the kind of stuff that has been done over and over again in these health systems. And it's done everywhere from retail, but health can take a lot from other industries, right? Can learn from a lot of other industries right now because they're having to do things at scale that they typically don't. And
Right.
so it's not going to be over in a month or even probably 4, right? This is something that'll take time. And as the world gets healthier and we get smarter, we can work smarter. And so that'll be fun to do together. There's so many little innovations that the great news is that everybody is open ears, right?
Yeah.
Nobody is digging their feet in and going, let's do it like we used to, right? Because that's broken. So they're just hungry for not only how can I do this, but how can I help?
Oh,
And
totally.
healthcare is one of those industries where, and when the world gets sick, you get busy, right? And you do it with an open heart.
Yeah.
So it's a good place to work.
Now, along the same theme of that we've been going along here, another cheesy reference, pop culture reference. So, if you had a hot tub time machine, you could go back a
Mhm.
few months, and there was an innovation that you could bring to the table that would just help kind of where we're at right now. What
Mhm.
would be some of your suggestions based on what you know now versus what you knew then? What would you propose?
I would go back to approximately the September timeframe when we knew that there were vaccines were coming, and would have a much larger conversation with folks that were contributing to Operation Warp Speed, which was in and of itself an innovation where everybody was talking.
Yep.
But really talk about the fact of, do we have technology in place right now that tracks this whole loop, right? What's happening today is that there's probably 10 players, 20 players, maybe even, right? If you count some of the smaller firms that are saying, hey, I got a way to vaccine manage, or people are building things homegrown. The challenge is that when you're doing mass immunizations, to get to the level of immunization that we need to, you need to open up Disneyland and parking lots and Walmarts and just let everybody in. And they may be from different health systems, because even the health systems themselves don't have the volume to get patients in and out the way that they need to. So the concept that's what I would have done. That's of course what's on the table right now, but getting that ramp up and done, and having it done in a holistic way, you need leadership from the federal level, and we didn't have that at the time. All right, so that would have been really screaming into the wind a little bit, but you know, uh, if I had a crystal ball and omnipotent, I would do that.
No, and so there's a common theme of everything that you've recommended. the common theme is, guys, you guys got to talk more. Collaboration, and that's kind of a foundational thing here. And so that's been a common theme of all the recommendations: is we need to be talking more effectively, openly, etc.
Yeah, and share information. And this is maybe the undercurrent that isn't understood exactly is, can you share that kind of information on a common platform and not have it be secure, have it be HIPAA compliant, have it the PHI be secure and non-transferable? Can you protect trade secrets? And the answer to all of that, of course, you and I know through cybersecurity is yes, without a doubt. And that exists. And that is built in, ladies and gentlemen, to these platforms. So please don't hesitate if you're thinking about this and thinking about doing something new for your patients, doing something new for your system to make your work more efficient and your reporting processing more efficient. It's all plausible right now here. And the challenge is, of course, is how do we get everybody to agree on which one it is? That's where the talking comes in. Yeah. Right. We can't get everybody to do the same thing. But the good news is that with open APIs, if you can get them talking to at least to, the same reporting process, like, for example, the federal government or your state and local government, that will solve a lot of the issues by nature. So.
Yeah, I used to have a lot of these conversations when I was at Gartner with companies. And, there was a lot of the aspects that you talked about, and there was a lot of the business and legal aspects. Things, you had touched upon it a little bit with trade secrets. I'll go even further and say intellectual property and the monetization model around that, and maximizing, their exclusivity to that formula, and, before things go generic, et cetera. And so I think there needs to be a coming together of not only the companies, but also the government as well, and how this is regulated, so that everyone is incented to do the right thing. Because at the end of the day, human beings, like corporations, incentive drives behavior. And so just being super honest with ourselves and getting in front of that issue probably would not hurt.
Yeah, it wouldn't. And free is never free. Like when someone says, we'll give you this system, it'll be for free. For example, in the state of California, and I don't know if these two are correlated, but in the state of California, I had to register on a tool that was not Microsoft based to get in line for my vaccine. And within an hour, I was given a California saying, you just signed up for something. I did it with my work email too. You were just signed up for something that says that we're tracking your information, and in the state of California, we have to let you know when your information will be sold, and this information is the potential of being sold. And I was like, well, that is not, that is not something
that cool.
any patient consumer wants to hear when they're sharing their information. And that's one thing that's so wonderful about working at Microsoft, is that we know that doesn't happen. Right? We can sit in front of every customer and say, the way that our team always says is, like, we're not in the healthcare business. We are in the storage business, and your storage is your containers are your containers. Your data lake is your data lake. It doesn't mix with others. And when data is anonymized, right, and shared with the platform, it's not traceable back, right? So we can all work together on one platform and benefit from it and still remain secure and succinct. So that's something that is probably not common knowledge. When people start to think about the cloud, they think about this wild open space. Like I always think about Willy Wonka, when they had like the kid go sucked into the television and they had all these like blips and bloops above him. I think that's the way my parents seem to imagine the cloud, that like you can just kind of reach up and grab some data. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah. My parents, pretty much the same. So we covered a lot of ground, and I definitely want to be respectful of your time. But I've got two last questions for you.
Oh, okay.
The first one is, if people want to get a hold of you, what's the best way to get a hold of you? Is it like LinkedIn, email?
Yeah, LinkedIn's always the best way. Absolutely. That is something that as a platform, our team is super active on. You'll see, like I mentioned, David Rue, our chief medical officer. Like if you want to know really, really the cool, that David Rue is RHEW. And I follow him. You guys should all follow him. But me personally, hit me up on LinkedIn is a great way to catch up. And I'm always open to questions, and more so helping you find the right people, because there's the firm that we work in is full of experts, full of them. Mm-hmm.
Now, the last question for you is, you know, it's a personal one. So, if there was something that you're best known for, uh, professionally or not, it's your choice,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
that someone might not know. So, as an example, I'll give you an example about me. People might not know that I like to skydive. People would never probably know that because if
Mm-hmm.
you've been around me, you would see that I'm afraid of heights. So why the hell would I jump out of a plane? But I'm crazy and I like doing it. So for you, what would be something that people wouldn't know about you that would be interesting to share?
It's a pretty benign thing, but people are always surprised to find out that I have two loves besides my children and my husband, who are really my passions. But I love to bake, and I love to do fitness, like CrossFit and kind of pretty hardcore fitness. And of course, those two things feed each other. But the baking is the thing that people are always surprised about. They're always like, "Really, you bake?" But I don't just kind of bake. And a COVID has really, it's like when I am at my most heightened of stress, there's just nothing better than like butter and sugar and like a warm oven. And so really gotten into that show, British Baking Show, the Great
Oh
British
yeah.
Baking Show. Oh man. And so just making all sorts of things like scones and muffins, and there's always something baking at our house. And we all work out because I bake a ton, which
So
reminds me.
what's the number one most requested baked good from you?
The requested, well, the thing that I think was turned into the most fun is I didn't ever realize the art of baking a cake. So COVID has actually allowed for this, right? Even though I love to bake, I never took the time to bake cake. I never enjoyed cakes until I realized how delicious homemade cakes are. Somebody made one for me, and I was like, "This is amazing! This is not like this is not like a cupcake from Safeway." So so now we at our house birthdays people look forward to, and we started doing half birthdays too, right? And they get to request whatever cake they want, and so like whatever style, color. And I will spend it takes a good 3 or 4 days to make a good cake. You got to like
Yeah.
bake it and then layers and then decorate it. And that is it. I'll have to share some of my most recent hits with you, but I've even started to like work on calligraphy so that I could do the letters, because we got time, man.
Right.
It's got time, right? So you don't be surprised if I'm not on camera for a work video, and like Tierney might be like baking something right now because I got a lot of
See a
beer.
little flower on your cheek or something. Yeah.
Easy. I will bust out some cookies or some muffins just to perk up my mood. Yeah.
Nice.
And it's
Love
hard
it.
during COVID. You can't give people your baked goods. They're like, "Ooh, are these full of virus?" Like, So I used to just give them away, like at the gym and stuff. You can't do that anymore. So
Right. Well,
yeah.
listen, this has been a super, super fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you coming on and talking to everybody about what you do and all your insights. And hopefully, you'll come back and share even more again sometime.
Oh, I love it, Mike. This is really fun.
All right. Thank you. Till next time.
Yes.
Wow, how cool was that? Tierney, I mean, just blew my head off. What a smart gal. Tons and tons of really interesting insights from her around, all these different spaces, from, the vaccine development and the R&D and some of the challenges there, to the logistics on getting these vaccines to pharmacies and doctors, to some of the challenges both from a societal perspective and from a logistics perspective on actually getting the vaccine into a human body. And so super, super fascinating stuff. I can't thank her enough for coming on. Now, like with all episodes, all the links and show notes will be on vnextpod.com. That's vnextpod.com. All right, guys, we'll see you next time.